everyone to this episode of Freedom Hub's Working Group. I'm your host, Jeff Cantor, along with my co-host, Charles Froman. We're definitely sponsored by the Marketplace for Health, Wealth, and Freedom, and it is for sure the Disruptors intersection. You'll definitely want to take a chance to check that out. What we want you to realize is that when you get over there, one of the key things is that you're over here on the home page and you hover over webinars, which takes us where we are today. But a real important part of this is continuing the conversation. Why? Because after you hear what we're talking about today, you might want to get involved a little more deeply, and this will be your chance to connect with that particular guest. So keep an eye out for that when we get going. But for today, we've got a fantastic guest. We've got Jacob Hornberger. He is the founder of the Future Freedom Foundation, and I would like to have Charles kind of give us a little rundown on who Jacob is, and then we're going to let him give us the rundown.
Excellent, Jeff. Let me know if I'm not coming through clearly. But this is Jacob Hornberger's return to Freedom Hub. He presented a year ago on a controversial thesis he put forward that to look for the ideal structure of society, just look at America 100 years ago in the 19th century before the progressive era. And maybe he can touch on that in the context of his talk today, that healthcare wouldn't be so expensive and of questionable quality and now threatening our livelihoods if it weren't so settled by the government. Jacob was a trial lawyer in Texas before he became a law and economics professor at the University of Dallas. He got into the libertarian scholarly world by working at the Foundation for Economic Education. He was a frequent guest on Fox News with Neil Cavuto and Napolitano's show. He then started his own org, Future Freedom Foundation, FFF.org, which I hope folks subscribe to their daily email. As he discussed a year ago, he embarked to collect the best liberty articles from mainstream sources, so that when you try to push liberty on your friends, you're using mainstream sources like the Washington Post that they read, but we don't really read that stuff. So definitely that is a takeaway for today's event. What's interesting also for Jeff and me as libertarians is that Jacob put his hat in the ring for president this last go around against Trump and Biden. He did not win the libertarian nomination, which was depressing for some of us. I think a lot of us wanted him to be the nominee because, I was involved with Gary Johnson the last two go-arounds, and I think Jacob's campaign had a good reason to exist. People wanted a more principled message with a good messenger, and given Jacob's law background, long-term work, and scholarly efforts, he really impressed people as the right person to be the third choice between Trump and Biden. But, the party went another direction, and I don't think it really performed that well, the ticket that, was put forward. So I hope Jacob can talk about that too. I mean, his stick was, go hard or go home, be principled, and really in healthcare, what better place and to push the envelope. We could talk about the old people having better private insurance before Medicare came on board in the 60s. Would healthcare be tied to the workplace without government? Would 100 million workers be facing unemployment now if they don't want to take part in a vaccine experiment if healthcare wasn't settled or tied to the government? So that's the intro, Jeff.
All right. Well, that sounds pretty exciting for sure. So, Jacob, I hope you're ready for all of that. Here you go.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jeff. And it's nice to be back here at Freedom Hub. It's an honor and a pleasure. And thank you, Charles, for that expansive introduction. I thought I would focus in on, as an introductory subject, the healthcare debate, because it really encompasses everything that we do as libertarians. I am a libertarian. And as a libertarian, I differ from conservatives. I differ from progressives. One of my beefs with conservatives, as well as conservative-oriented libertarians, is that they orient toward reform, that they're willing to settle for reform. And they have settled for reform. There's conservatives that have spent their entire lives coming up with ways to reform education. That's what school vouchers are all about. In healthcare, health savings accounts, income tax reform, CIA reform. And as libertarians, we take a different approach. We want freedom. I mean, that's what libertarianism is all about. And we've always got to keep that in mind, that that's our goal. Our goal is not to have a warmed over, better, improved serfdom. And people who settle for reform for things like health savings accounts and school vouchers and income tax reform and so forth, they're settling for an improved serfdom. An analogy of this would be like slavery. If we were in the 19th century, say in 1855, Alabama, there would be some conservatives, some conservative-oriented libertarians. They would say, look, Jacob, you're tilting at windmills if you're going to try to get rid of slavery. It's in the Constitution. It's so well entrenched here that we've just got to settle for reform. So we're going to try to get legislation enacted with fewer lashings and better work conditions for the slaves, better food, better health care. And I would sit there and say, well, that's fine. You can spend your life doing that, but that doesn't really interest me. I want freedom. And that means making the case for abolishing slavery. As difficult as it is, that we've got to be making that case for people to start considering it. Well, the same thing applies to healthcare. That we've lived under a government-run system, all of our lives, really. And we've all become so accustomed to it that we've just come to accept it, or at least a lot of people have come to accept it. Medicare and Medicaid are now part of our lives. That was the most prominent part of the healthcare system. But as we've learned in this pandemic, there's another component to this, and that's the central planning aspect of healthcare, like the Centers for Disease Control, the FDA, the President's Task Force, whatever it's called on healthcare. You've got state governments and local governments issuing edicts, lockdowns, mask mandates, and so forth, sometimes without even the approval of the state legislature or the city council. You got these little dictators that are doing these kind of things. Well, one approach is to reform this system, improve this system. Now, if we divide this healthcare problem in two, which I think it really needs to be divided into two halves. The first half is Medicare and Medicaid. These are two socialist programs. Before the pandemic hit, we all know that healthcare was in crisis. It was a major crisis. That was what Obamacare was all about, was to reform, to try to fix the healthcare crisis. And we all know it didn't. And that was why the left, the progressives, were moving toward a fully socialized, government-run, government-provided healthcare system, like in Cuba or North Korea. Well, one answer to that was, oh, Jacob, you're never going to get anywhere. You're going to be tilting at windmills, whether it's in the political arena or whether it's where you're not going to get any votes if you go with the libertarian position, or in the ideological arena. The mainstream press won't publish your op-eds. We've got to just settle for the fact that Medicare and Medicaid are here to stay. They're here permanently, and let's just try to make it better. And so that's where health savings accounts came into play. And the people that advocate health savings accounts say, well, this is a free market approach. And some even say it's a libertarian approach. Well, this is nonsense. It's just another interventionist socialist reform plan that is designed to make the state-run system run. There's only one freedom solution to Medicare and Medicaid, and that's abolish them immediately. Now, does that scare people? Oh, yeah, because when you're growing up under a socialist system, you're accustomed to it. You're dependent on it. You're psychologically dependent on it. And so it's terrifying. Oh, my gosh, Jacob, you would have people dying in the streets, and they would, they would go without health care, the people that couldn't afford it and so forth. Well, we've got to remember that America had the finest healthcare system in history before Medicare and Medicaid. I grew up in the poorest city in the United States. Doctors' offices were filled every day, and most people couldn't pay. And a lot of people were from Nuevo Laredo. I lived in Laredo, Texas, which is right on the border. A lot of the doctors' offices were filled from people from Mexico. The doctors knew they couldn't pay, but there was never a case where a doctor turned away anybody. Doctors did this out of a sense of moral duty, ethical duty. And they were still the second richest people in town, second only to the oil people. So they were doing very well. Healthcare costs were so low and so stable, nobody had major medical insurance. I think some people, the well-to-do may have had catastrophic insurance to protect against cancer or something like that, but nobody had major medical. Why? Because it was like going to the grocery store. Who has grocery store insurance to protect against soaring grocery prices? Nobody. Well, that's the way it was with healthcare. You go to the doctor, it's just a cost of doing business, a cost of living, like your car repair. It was only when Medicare and Medicaid came into existence to address a problem that didn't exist. The poor were getting adequately treated in that voluntary system. And that's when healthcare costs started soaring. You got fraud built into the system. We all know what socialist programs do, massive artificial demand. And so what's the prescription? Well, we libertarians have to lead. We can't settle for this reform nonsense. The way you lead out of this, you make the case for healthcare freedom, which means abolishing Medicare, abolishing Medicaid. On the supply side, getting rid of occupational licensure. And the best person that made the case for that, and the best case, was Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize winning libertarian economist. Showed how you could get rid of licensing in the healthcare field and everybody would benefit. And so when we start making that case, now we're talking about moving toward the ideal free society. Now, the other component of this is the central planning aspect of this, which none of us really paid much attention to. The Centers for Disease Control, we knew about the FDA with drugs and so forth, but nobody really paid a whole lot of attention till the pandemic hit. And who would have ever dreamed that this would be happening at this stage of our lives? Well, it came out in full force and effect. You got the Centers for Disease Control coming up with all these recommendations for mandates. You had total chaos in this system, which is central planning is a socialist paradigm. That's what socialism is in large part, central planning. And that's what this healthcare field is, central planning. So you had shortages of ventilators right off the bat. You had shortages of masks, as you'll recall, shortages of everything, hand sanitizer and so forth. I mean, there was total chaos in the early days. And it only got worse and more tyrannical. When government's given in charge of something or put in charge of something, it's going to exercise power. The notion that we can put government in charge of something and it's going to act like a libertarian would or in some benign way it's a pipe dream. So they start erecting mask mandates and mandatory lockdowns, shutting down businesses, throwing people into bankruptcy, vaccine passports. Now Biden's talking about imposing federal mandates on businesses if they don't require vaccinations. We saw it all at the state and local level. Well, what has been the response of the conservatives as well as conservative-oriented libertarians? It's all what I call whack-a-mole. Hey, whack this mole, mask mandates, knock it down. Hey, knock this down. Vaccine passports, knock that down. And as things progressed, we all thought, well, hey, we're going to reach a critical mass of vaccinated people and the death toll is going to drop and the crisis is going to be over. And then lo and behold, we get the Delta variant where all of a sudden everything's being ramped up again. And it's the same thing, whack-a-mole, mask mandates, oppose them. Well, okay, that's all fine and good. I'm the first one to oppose any of these mandates, but it's not freedom, Jeff. That if we want freedom, we have to think at a higher level and we have to make the case to our fellow Americans. We got a great opportunity here. Crises present opportunities. And if we squander this opportunity, it may never come again. People are thinking, they're reflecting as compared to, like before the pandemic, to argue for healthcare freedom might be sort of esoteric. Now people are thinking, especially when they're faced with the prospect of death, the only solution to this is a separation of healthcare and the state. That's the case we should be making as libertarians. This is the way we lead America to liberty, not to some reformed, warmed over serfdom of health, opposing healthcare mandates and so forth. What I'm suggesting is that people who oppose healthcare mandates and lockdowns, great, but at the same time, use the opportunity to make the case for giving government entirely out of healthcare at the state level, the local level, and the national level, the same way our ancestors got government out of the religion business. That if we had government running the churches as we have government running the healthcare system, we'd have all these fights over who should be the ministers and what should be taught in the churches and whether there should be mandates and church vouchers. And well, we avoid all of that by separating church and state. That was the wisdom of our ancestors. We need to build on that in healthcare, well, in education as well. But let's stick with healthcare, where we separate healthcare in the state, both at the national level and at the state and local level. Then when something like this happens, a health problem, it's not a political problem anymore. These government officials don't know what they're doing. They're like running around like chickens with their heads cut off. Then we look to the healthcare industry to lead us out of this morass. So you've got some healthcare providers that are saying, hey, we recommend that businesses require masks of all their customers. Okay, some businesses might follow that. Other businesses might not. Customers could choose. Workers could choose where they're going to work. In that way, you come up with the best solution. And then finally, when you have a free market like that, it gives people the impetus to come up with solutions from the ground up. Central planning doesn't provide for that. The knowledge of the central planner is very limited. It's what Friedrich Hayek called the fatal conceit of the planner. But at the free market level, all the ideas are coming from the ground up. And that's where you get the solutions that nobody anticipated. I believe that if we'd had a free market healthcare system, we'd have been out of this pandemic a long time ago, just because the free market is so good at developing solutions to these kind of things. So on that note, let me just wrap it up and say, we libertarians should be leading the country and really leading the world to freedom. And a great way to do that right now is with healthcare liberty by separating healthcare in the state and making that case.
Excellent, Jacob. That was great. We're going to take some questions here in a second, but one of the ones I would kick it off with is the fact that, you're right about the idea of it being an opportunity, because everybody is so busy in their everyday life and every other kind of thing, until there's some sort of like burning fire in front of everyone's face, no one's collectively paying attention. So I hope we don't blow it, because you're absolutely right. With the problem that we've historically had is that what I call the next generation syndrome, because in our generation, they pass this thing, it's terrible, we fight like crazy, but the kids become born and they just knew it from day one. And so they don't ever think of some other different way. So the opportunity breaks through that. So that's why I say that is a fantastic thing. But the follow-up, though, is if we break through and make the good thing happen, how do we still get the right kind of person in government to leave us alone? Because it seems like that if we're always going to fight, because there's always going to be a new generation of meddlesome people, how do we keep them away?
I don't think you can depend on that. This is why I love constitutional amendments. I mean, the argument was made after the Constitution was adopted that we didn't need a Bill of Rights, which is really a bill of prohibitions. It doesn't give people rights at all. And the argument was, well, look, this is a government of limited powers. If it doesn't have the power, it can't exercise it. For example, you can look in the Constitution, there's no power to provide healthcare or regulate healthcare. So the federal government shouldn't be doing that. But the people that were in favor of the Bill of Rights said, no, that's not good enough for us. We want to make it real clear that they don't have the power to take away freedom of speech and freedom of religion, freedom of the press, gun rights. And so by doing this, it really solidified that, notice, the federal government doesn't get involved in religion. There's a lot of disputes in religion, and the federal government's not there, and neither are the state governments by virtue of the 14th Amendment. Well, I love that kind of constitutional amendment, both for the federal government and the state government, that would say, no, and this would be the amendment, no law shall be enacted by either the federal government or the state governments respecting the provision or regulation of healthcare or abridging the free exercise thereof. Once you get that kind of superior law enacted, then it doesn't really matter who's in office. They can't do anything. And that, of course, depends on an active judiciary to enforce it. But I think that's the ultimate solution to this, because if we rely on the goodness of government officials, that's not very trustworthy.
No, definitely not, for sure. Just more the idea of them just being too neutered to do much, which is really what it's about. Because you're right. Charles and I've been involved in the health field for years. we can see the fallacy of anything being involved, because all the little entrepreneurs we run into with our shows, they're doctors. Yeah, because they live in the system. So they themselves see better than anyone the fallacies of it. And they're the ones coming up with the innovations to break out the better app, the different this, the cash only, surgical centers. It's fantastic. Charles?
Yes, great presentation, Jacob. And I was wondering, during your presidential campaign, when asked about healthcare questions, and assuming you gave the same stock answer about repealing all the government interferences in healthcare, are you able to itemize as best you can all the health laws you might repeal, going back as far as you can? You could go back 100 years, and there's a lot of them. So, what is your best effort to list all the interferences that cause problems, not just Medicare and Medicaid, but others?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned my race with the Libertarian Party. So I'd like to share with you a story about in regard to this particular issue, which I think was kind of humorous and very revealing of what's happened, not just in the party, but in the movement. You see, one of my real beefs with the Libertarian movement and the Libertarian Party is that there's no Libertarian brand anymore. Or I should say, the brand is more of a mush. It's a conservative, libertarian, reform-oriented mush rather than a pure libertarian brand, which is, I think, what they should have kept and the movement should have kept. But at the very first Libertarian Party convention I went to, where I announced my candidacy, there was a presidential debate. And I didn't qualify because I hadn't announced in advance in a sufficient amount of time. But I went to the debate anyway. And the very first question, or one of the first questions that came out of the moderator's mouth, and the moderator was Matt Welch from Reason Magazine, who he was very active in the party and of course the movement as well. And he asked everybody on the stage, what would you do about Medicare? So everybody answered in some form or fashion, but nobody said abolish it. It was just, health savings accounts, or I think the state should handle it, and that type of thing. So I went back home and I wrote an article on my campaign website saying, well, I didn't have a chance to participate in that debate, but I just want everybody to know how I would have answered that question. I would have abolished it immediately without any hesitation. And I explained why it should be abolished. Well, you would have thought that I had just done the worst sin. Matt Welch immediately goes on the attack, and in Reason, with an article saying, Jacob's just trying to show he's more libertarian or more hardcore than everybody else. And that was certainly not my objective. I never said that. But it's a standard debate that the reform crowd is always leveled at those of us that want liberty. And it's not a matter of measuring who's more libertarian or not. How would you even measure such a thing? Suppose you have somebody that favors drug laws and is 80% libertarian, and somebody who opposes drug laws and 20% libertarian. Who's more libertarian? You see, so it's a ridiculous measure. The point I'm making is that if you want freedom, you've got to get rid of these socialist programs. Now, if you don't want freedom and you're willing to settle for something less, okay, but we shouldn't be under any pretensions. And so that was the case I made throughout the campaign, is we've got to raise people's standard here, raise our vision to the level of liberty. Now, specifically to address your question, the big ones, of course, are Medicare and Medicaid. Now, that's the provision of healthcare. You've also got a multiplicity of regulations. I mean, I wouldn't begin to tell you what all the regulations are, but it is a highly strictly regulated system. I mentioned occupational licensure, which I think is the huge one, that if you opened up the market to healthcare providers without licensure laws, you would dramatically lower the cost of healthcare. People would be free to get alternative healthcare without getting prosecuted. But you've got insurance regulation, you've got regulation of doctors' offices, OSHA, all sorts of things that would immediately end with the kind of constitutional prohibition I'm talking about, separation of healthcare in the state. And of course, that's at the federal level. You got the FDA that has to approve drugs that sometimes take 20 years to get approved. You've got the state governments involved in healthcare regulation. So the reason I like the healthcare argument, healthcare liberty, constitutional amendments separating healthcare and the state, is that it makes the case for getting government entirely out of healthcare. So that rather than focus in on this regulation or that regulation and why it's bad and that's bad, let's just talk at a higher level and get government entirely out of the healthcare arena. Is that a tougher case? Absolutely, it's a tougher case. But to me, when I became a libertarian, that's what attracted me to libertarianism, is that I read hardcore, pure essays. That was how I discovered libertarianism, little books that had pure, hardcore, no compromise essays on what freedom means. And that's when I said, man, I'm a libertarian. I think if I had read this reform nonsense, I wouldn't be a libertarian.
So Classy, you're saying that here's an image that we use in our medical webinar. This is a picture of just the benefits and services for low-income individuals. So the thing is, when this comes to libertarianism, the reality is the discussion of whether we're going to try to figure out what is best is like it takes us 5 minutes and the discussion is over. We hope you're enjoying the show, and we're just giving you a quick message here from the marketplace. You'll find us at your-mp.com. When you get over there, you'll be on this main site. You'll hover over the home tab and you'll find webinars in the drop down. When you get over there, scroll down the bottom of the screen and you'll see the area here to check out the old videos, and you'll see all these great ones. You'll really enjoy it. Here's an example of them up on Brighteon. Now, the main thing to remember is this is a site for your health, wealth, and freedom. Well, let's talk about your health for a minute. If you're looking to try to figure out how to escape from the stranglehold of insurance and the inability to do what you prefer, you need to take a look at this program. It's at patientempowerment.mpb.health. I think you'll find it pretty exciting. Also, let's talk about your wealth. If your money could actually talk to you, would you listen to it? That's a good question. Well, here's a way to find out what your money's trying to tell you is by getting a free analysis. Here's a person who had 24 debts. It was going to take them 20 years, but by using this program and tools, they were out in 8.5 years, and they did it without refinancing or consolidating or making any changes at all. So this way you can get that free analysis. No background check, no credit check, no social security, no anything. Very, very anonymous. You just head over to this website, bit.ly/debt to wealth. You'll pull down this form, just simply fill it in. Lender could be like lender number 1 type of thing. Send it back in. You'll get a free report, and you'll see how quickly you can also get yourself out of debt. So let's get back to the show. You start going that other path, it's never done. Look what it becomes, because it certainly didn't start out like this.
But see, Jeff, this is what I'm talking about, whack-a-mole, that you could spend every day of the year hitting some aspect of healthcare regulation or provision or whatever. I mean, there's always something going on. You could do it with the post office. You could do it with public schooling. That's why I called it whack-a-mole. Is that what we libertarians want to be doing the rest of our lives? Not for me. I want to make the case for getting rid of all these things in one fell swoop. Because if we can reach a critical mass of people that see that and say, wow, let's just separate the whole thing, then we're not playing whack-a-mole anymore. Now we're talking about liberty.
And innovation. Dr. Campbell, I see your hand up.
Yeah, it's a great presentation. I'm a physician who lives inside that poster, Mr. Cantor, so I know exactly what a lot of those circles and squares mean. There's a lot of frustration. The thing that I would ask you is, I'm looking for a realistic way. You know, this last election, the second most liberal senator in the United States almost became the Democratic nominee, and the only senator more liberal than Bernie Sanders is now the vice president of the United States. So don't we have to win a lot of minds and hearts before we go out there and say, vote for me because I'm going to do this? It seems like we got to lay a foundation somehow, somewhere.
I think that the only foundation you can make is that libertarian foundation. That when you try to reach out to an electorate that is pretty statist oriented by watering down your principles in order to expand your vote totals or in the ideological arena to get approval, you're lost. I mean, we are who we are. And I made this point throughout the campaign. We are libertarians. That means something. There's a certain brand. If you go back to, let's say, the 1990 platform of the Libertarian Party, it is a hardcore purist libertarian manifesto. None of this watered down libertarianism. That's the case we have to make to the American people. And then whatever happens at that point, if they say, well, okay, we understand your position, we don't want it, okay, that's fine. But at least we've remained true to ourselves. The only chance we have is just by making the case for liberty. For example, let's talk about, stick with healthcare liberty. Why would anyone think of the idea of separating healthcare in the state if they've grown up under this system of abolishing all these programs? It would never occur to them. It's so far beyond the thinking. It's an entirely new paradigm, a different paradigm. So the only way somebody can think about that is if you present it to them. In a sense, we're kind of like Johnny Appleseeds. We present the idea to them. And this is what I've said, for a long time, that this is what Libertarian Party candidates should be doing. Going out there, everybody on the same page, making clear, this is what we libertarians want to do. All right, people wouldn't necessarily agree, but it's the only shot there is by making that case. All great movements for liberty have been led by a very small minority of people. And that minority of people have maintained the purity of their brand, explaining what we're about. By watering it down, you destroy the brand. One of the funniest fundraising letters I get on the Libertarian Party sometimes, I just laugh at it. Jacob, would you send me money so I can get my message out? I got to get my message out. I said, well, why do you have to get your message out? The party's been here for 50 years. Everybody should understand what libertarianism is in the political arena, but everybody doesn't because there is no libertarian brand. It's a mush. It's a conservative libertarian mush. And when you got mush, nobody knows where it stands. So I say, take your chances, run a bold campaign, be able to defend your position. Remember, you can't just get out there and make a position for healthcare liberty or educational liberty. You got to be prepared to defend it adequately, because nothing worse can befall a good cause than to have it ineptly defended. Forget who said that, but it's very true. So I say, stick with principles, learn your arguments, and let's restore our brand of libertarianism, which is liberty.
Fantastic. Charles?
Yes, Jacob, this is a great conversation to have. A couple questions. What happened with your campaign where the party chose another? I mean, you seem to have a good block behind you, number one. Number two, I think your thesis has evidence, especially this past year, while some of us were pretty loud and active against the draconian orders, locking us down and now threatening everyone with loss of employment or access to shopping or travel or learning if they don't accept being a guinea pig in an increasingly dangerous experiment. Jeffrey Tucker was loud and active, hammering the dominant propaganda about the COVID hysteria. A lot of libertarians were not good. They were just science is settled cheerleaders for the CDC. So it's not just those of us who have, pushed health savings accounts over the years as a modest reform and not been more hardcore about healthcare payment in general. But the past year's COVID hysteria really has set libertarians back, and that they were horribly weak on asserting our rights to, have control of our health decisions, and just thinking the CDC was exempt from regulatory capture, as if pharma was pure in its intent. Have you noticed that over the past year with the COVID hysteria, how weak libertarians have been?
Absolutely. And I think it's because of this mindset that we've got to accept the fact that government is involved in healthcare, and now let's just figure out a way to make it work. And once you fall to that level, then you're in the muck. You're in the muck. You're just arguing over how a socialist system should run. You mentioned about my race. I kept saying that, and we were doing very well, as you intimated. We were winning primaries. We were winning straw polls. But I always knew that there was this force out there, the reform-oriented people, what they call the pragmatists. And these are the people that say we need to water down the libertarianism in order to get votes. And I totally oppose that. I've opposed it the entire time that I've been in the LP. And I served 3 terms on the platform committee where I saw this debate taking place back in the 90s. Let's water down the message so we can get votes. It's the wrong approach. But I knew that force was out there. I just didn't know when they were going to surface. But I always assumed that Justin Amash was going to run. And I told my campaign manager, I said, you've got to assume he's going to announce. And it was just a matter of time. And so when he announced, then that force within the party came out in full force and effect. The pragmatists, the people that did not want a pure libertarian running. They were saying Jacob's going to take us back to 1% and all this. And my argument is, look, we're libertarians. We need to fight as libertarians. Let's run a bold campaign here. That if you run a safe campaign, which is Republican oriented, it's going to be boring. And I like Jo. Jo's a good friend, but we just disagree. She wants to save Social Security. I said, let's go in there with a head-on approach of repeal Social Security. Make that case. Why government has no business establishing this socialist program or the national security establishment. Let's not talk about just getting rid of the forever wars, which even the Democrats and Republicans were doing. Let's talk about dismantling the entire national security state and restoring a limited government republic. Let's talk about getting rid of Medicare and Medicaid. This is something that was shocking to the pragmatist crowd, to the pragmatic reform-oriented crowd. And they all coalesced around Amash, and we were getting overwhelmed. That was like a tsunami when Amash came in. All the mainstream press was already assuming that he was going to be the nominee. And we knew it was coming, but then all of a sudden he drops out, which was shocking to us. But that force that he coalesced went over to Jo, and Jo she ran a brilliant campaign, and she kind of stayed in the background the whole time. And then at the end, surfaced around 2 weeks before, and man, she carried over and she won. And I tip my hat to her. She ran a good campaign. But I still say that the party should be looking toward not these Republican-oriented figures, conservative-oriented figures. We should be running libertarian campaigns that are pure libertarianism. Let the chips fall where they may. But my hunch is that there's a lot of libertarians out there that don't know they're libertarians. And the only way to find those people is by making the case for libertarianism so they can say, like I did when I saw it, hey, I'm a libertarian. But if you run nothing but mushy campaigns, all you're going to find is mushy people. And those mushy people are usually going to stay with Democrats and Republicans.
Plus, typically the mushy people are not willing to stand on the corner and collect signatures. You need the person that has a commitment level. And you're right, it's a lot clearer than most people want to make it out. It's pretty black and white. In our little health world, we always say it's like trying to explain the concept of being a little bit pregnant. Either you are or you're not. What's this big long discussion we're having here? So you're absolutely right about that. And any strong person over history, everyone told them they were a nut one way or another half the time, and they still persisted, and they became icons and famous, and because they stuck to something that was a good brand instead of trying to, well, how do you make that pop single? You always write these weird songs there, Jacob. Why don't you write a pop song kind of a thing? You're done. Your career is over. So you're absolutely right.
Well, and your point about petitioning is really good, because I've done a lot of petitioning. I'm a good petitioner. I can get a lot of signatures in one day. I'm not so sure under this COVID thing, but your petitioning is a hard thing to do, and you've got to inspire people to do it, members to do it. You can go out and pay your paid petitioners. That's a lot of money. But in order to get people to go out and petition for you, you got to inspire them. And to me, a hardcore libertarian campaign is inspiring. When I first joined the party, there was a guy named Bill Evers that called me and said he was a California activist. And he said, hey, I want you to join the platform committee. And I said, no, not interested. And he says, why? And I said, because it's a political party. They're just watering down the message. And he says, have you ever read the party platform? And I said, no. And he says, let me send it to you. So he sends it to me, and it's this hardcore purist manifesto. And this is 1990. And I was just shocked. So I called him back up and I said, man, if you'll still have me, it would be an honor to serve on the platform committee of this party. And guys, it didn't matter to me. I didn't even ask, what's your vote total? How many candidates are you running? How many members do you have? None of that mattered to me. What mattered to me was that this was a party that stood squarely, purely for libertarian principles. That was enough for me. They could have added 10 members and I'd have been out there petitioning and serving on the platform committee and doing whatever. But I don't think you're going to do that when you're running these watered down Republican progressive type of campaigns that are just trying to water down the message to get votes from people.
And then you end up getting co-opted by your competition and you're knocked off. And then people forgot you're the guy that invented whatever it is, and everybody else capitalized on it and turned it into the household thing. So yeah, you're
you see, it's interesting you say that, because you see Larry Elder. Y'all know who Larry Elder is?
Yes, for
okay.
sure. This recent run in California against Governor Newsom.
Yeah, he was leading the pack in the Republican arena. And as y'all know, he's got a lot of libertarian leanings. And one of the things that he stood for was abolish the minimum wage. And the LA Times attacked him on it. I came to his defense on it because, it's a no-brainer for libertarians that minimum wage is horrific. Well, it occurred to me, what if a libertarian were running and in order to try to pacify people and water down the message, wanted to just reduce the minimum wage or oppose an increase in the minimum wage? How would he deal with Elder? Elder would have circumvented him as a Republican with a harder core libertarian position. And I thought, this is a good example of why libertarians should not be adopting Republican positions, because one of these days a Republican is going to out-libertarian them.
I think you just coined a new word. Charles, you there?
Yeah. So Jacob, things are going to get worse in this country. There is a great reset, international elite crowd exploiting this hysteria and fear to ratchet up their controls. I mean, the vaccine mandates really are part of a behavioral control effort. And it's going to get worse. Do you agree with that? I mean, a lot of folks are saying that. And
I do.
Do you think if that is happening, that the tightening of the screws are going to wake up people even more? I mean, COVID has woken up people. You mentioned that this is the right time to go bold. It's going to get worse. Do you think that's going to wake up people? And if so, do you see anyone apart from yourself that could run for president in the next go around, against maybe DeSantis and Biden or Kamala? Any up and coming libertarians to save us?
Well, I do think things are going to get worse. And the worst that can happen is you have a perfect storm of crises. I think we're looking at a big crisis in federal spending and debt. I mean, federal spending is out of control. Debt's out of control. And you've got all the progressives saying, oh, this is no big deal, no problem. This is actually stimulus and all this nonsense. This is not going to end well. The dollar could very well crater. You could have runs on banks. There's no telling. To me, it's not a question of whether, it's a question of when. And then you've got the healthcare pandemic thing, which they're using as an excuse to really incarcerate us in this tyrannical system that they're imposing on us under healthcare rationalizations. And then you've got the possibility of a foreign policy crisis. Notice that they're now turning the war on terrorism inward. They're saying, oh, the threats are domestic. Well, they're talking about people that are going to be questioning what they're doing when these crises come. That's the last time last thing they want is people to be criticizing them in a financial crisis, economic crisis. And then there's the foreign policy crises. The Pentagon and the CIA are not going to give up just because they've lost Afghanistan to the Taliban. They're already stirring up trouble with China. They've got their forever enemy, the Russia, always on the back burner. They're going to keep intervening around the world, hoping to stir up crises. maybe another terrorist attack. And so you could have a confluence of all these crises. And so now's the time to be talking about these ideas when people are thinking rationally, because once a crisis hit, rational thinking is in pretty short supply. So for example, right now we're running a conference, online conference at the Future of Freedom Foundation every Tuesday evening on restoring our civil liberties. We've got 10 outstanding speakers. Why now? Well, because we can see that their sights are now turning inward with their war on terrorism. That means that they're going to look at critics here. And we've seen what their war on terrorism does with Guantanamo Bay, where they're locking up people indefinitely, torturing people. Now's the time to be building the case for the free society. And that's the idea behind, this show and behind the Future of Freedom Foundation and other libertarian foundations. This is an opportunity we have here, as like I said earlier. We need to seize that opportunity on all areas, not just healthcare, educational liberty, financial liberty, getting rid of the Federal Reserve, free market monetary system, getting rid of the whole welfare state. This is where libertarians falter. I don't know of anyone in the Libertarian Party that takes the position. Well, no, I take it back. I think Arvin made the position of abolish the welfare state. I don't know of anybody else that does. Dismantle Social Security, dismantle Medicare and Medicaid and farm subsidies and education grants, and make the case for voluntary charity. That's what we need here. Is we need libertarians to step up. Gosh, guys, there's guys my age now that have spent the last 30 years advancing reform. And where has it gotten us? If we all libertarians got on the same page, like on healthcare, and said, let's get government entirely out of healthcare. Now we've got a consistent message, a same message. People are going to say, now we know where you libertarians stand. That's what I think needs to happen right now, is libertarians need to do some soul searching, because you're not going to get conservatives leading us to liberty. You're not going to get progressive leading us to liberty. The only hope for leading us out of this morass is libertarians. And that's why it's incumbent on libertarians to do some soul searching right now and say, do I want reform? Is this what my life is going to be all about? Or do I want liberty? And I say, let's go for liberty.
Yeah, and you're right about the fact that it's on all fronts. You just can't pick our battles. Sadly, it's every one of those things you delineated, because that's how they're attacking, and that's what they've grown. But from your health to your life, the IRS track and everything. They want to just keep going and going and going. So you're absolutely right. We just have to go hardcore. Abigail, I see your hand is up.
Yes, thank you. I've enjoyed the conversation. I am a lifelong nurse, and I could not agree more about getting government out of healthcare. I run Michigan Healthcare Freedom to focus on state level health policy. Is there anything that is on your radar at the state level other than occupational licensure reform, which I completely agree with, by the way?
Unfortunately, most of my focus has always been at the federal level. And so I'm not really an expert on what's happening at the state level. All I can say is that when you look at the Constitution, traditionally under state powers, the states had the power to regulate healthcare. I mean, that was part of the police powers.
Yeah.
And that was part of the 10th Amendment. Now, I think the 14th Amendment does affect that, but what I keep saying is, regardless of what those restrictions are, let's get rid of them by separating healthcare in the state at the state level too. But I can't tell you what all those regulations are because I just don't keep up with that.
Sure. To complement what you already said about Medicare, Medicaid, and state licensure, were you aware that CMS leverages states to produce more occupational licensure?
Who does?
CMS, the Medicare Medicaid structure. They actually, it's one of the rules that they will not reimburse unless someone is licensed. And that in 2019 led to Michigan's Licensing Affairs Bureau informing the legislature that they had been doing a workaround in order for all of Michigan's counseling, local counselors, to be able to be reimbursed for mental health counseling by Medicare and Medicaid, and that they were no longer going to do it. And that meant that suddenly all of the local, affordable, cash pay counseling people were beating on their legislators' door. We want reimbursement. We want reimbursement. Give us licensure. And I tried. I was one voice against a 5,000 in a pop-up Facebook group. And I just didn't even, it was their livelihood is how they saw it. And yeah, their hero was the very conservative, supposedly, legislator who stepped up and got licensure passed for them. And so I'm still part of the group. I drop in there and everybody is nonstop asking, okay, how do you deal with this billing issue? What do you deal with that billing issue? It's not about clinical work anymore. It's about billing. And I'm like, did I or did I not tell you this? So I just thought, that's maybe one additional piece for your argument that the federal, they do want to run it, and they actually, by means of leverage like that, they are running the state affairs for licensure as well.
Well, first of all, good for you for standing up against that crowd of 500. You see, that's what I find inspiring. When I see one person standing up for what's right against a big crowd, you just never know the impact that you're going to have on somebody. And so kudos to you. And I know I didn't know that. It doesn't surprise me at all, because the heavy hand of government is doing its very best to expand its power and control. And the licensing laws are really just a protection racket. And that's what everybody needs to understand. And when Milton Friedman wrote that essay, he said, and I think it's in his book, Capitalism and Freedom. It's really worth reading. You can read it on our website at fff.org. Just Google Friedman. But he said, I could have made the case for why there shouldn't be licensure of shoeshine people or something like that. And he says, but no, he says, I wanted to take the toughest case, and that was the healthcare arena. And of course, I was a lawyer for 12 years, and you got occupational licensure there. The supposedly is supposed to guarantee ethical and competent lawyers. That's been a big winner. But it's a protection racket. It limits the supply of healthcare providers in order to keep income artificially higher than it would be in a free market. And the best thing we could ever do is just get rid of occupational licensure in every business, every occupation, just totally free up the market. And then all of a sudden you've got a whole new supply of healthcare providers coming in, people that say, oh, well, there'll be quacks doing brain surgery. It's ridiculous. Who would go to a quack for brain surgery? You don't even do that today. To go to a specialist, you ask what your doctor recommends, what your neighbors recommend. You go online, you do some research. That's what happened in a free market system. But at least you'd have people that want alternative healthcare free to do that without their providers getting prosecuted or shut out of the work. And so thank you for letting me know that. It just solidifies how I feel. And thank you for standing up for that principle against that crowd.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for bringing up the conversation again at the federal level. So many have simply given up, as you say. And it's like you say, this crisis, we should not let it go to waste. It's a time of disruption and unrest. And that's our opportunity just as much as it is for the centrists. So thanks for pushing.
You're welcome. And let me give you an example of the power of ideas. Like when you stood up in that crowd, you think, oh, well, everybody attacked me and so forth. You never really know how that's working out. There's a great essay called Isaiah's Job by Albert J. Nock that talks about the power of ideas and ideas on liberty, and I highly recommend it. But let me give you a personal example. In the 1950s, the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE, they published a series of little books called Essays on Liberty. Now, if somebody had asked the founder and president of FEE at that time in the 50s, what's the impact of those 4 little books, Leonard? He might have said, well, we've sold certain numbers of copies, or we've influenced this person or that person. But what he couldn't say was that these books would 20 years later or 25 years later find their way into a public library in Laredo, Texas, where a young lawyer would be going in there looking for something to read and find these 4 little books, and they would change the course of his life. And that's why, and they were hardcore purist essays on liberty, no compromise at all. So you stand for an idea, you never know what the impact of that idea is going to be. But that's why it's so important to stand for principle.
Well, I have to say, as an endpoint, that's very good, because you're talking about, you being inspired and needing everyone to be inspired. I think you inspired all of us today a little bit too. So that was fantastic. So I appreciate you being here today.
Oh, it's an honor and a pleasure, Jeff. Thank you very much. Thanks, Charles. Thanks for your viewers here asking some great questions. And I had a great time like I did last time.